Hello, my name is Harald Robert Bruch. I'm a hematologist from Bonn, near Cologne, the city with a big dome, perhaps you know. I'm interested in infectious diseases because I'm a professor of infectious diseases. And on the other hand, I'm a health economist. So HHH might be the link in this speech regarding the current economic and medical aspects in the light of the spread of the coronavirus in Europe. On the right edge, you see some ministers and people from Europe. In the center, our Chancellor Merkel, and you can read Together Today for a Healthy Tomorrow. This was a summit 3 years ago in Germany, and this is still ongoing, the theme for Merkel's policy. If you have any questions after the lecture, I'm on the end of the lecture in the classroom. You can ask or send me an email to my mail address drhrbruch@t-online.de you find on the bottom of the first slide. So what about Corona in our two countries? It's different. If you see the numbers in Germany and Bulgaria and compare them, you see it's 1,700 up to now in Bulgaria and 170,000 in Germany. So it's 1,000 times more often in Germany. Is this meaning Germany has more infection load, more infection risk, more death? We will see later. And if you compare the time, this was the 6th of March, as your minister, Prime Minister said, okay, we did not have any case. So 2 months later, now we have two numbers here with increasing numbers of corona in both countries. What is the sense of this lecture? The sense is to combine both fields, the field of medicine and the field of economics you are studying in Varna, and to talk about the interaction between these fields. To start with is because you don't have so much information in detail in medicine with the virus, then come to the economic consequences and to combine it and to see in the forecast what is the prognosis in economics and medicine. If you see this global risk analysis from the insurance group Zurich, published in the beginning of 2020, you see on the left side many dots in colors, and you think, okay, infection diseases, very on the left side, is not so important. Everybody talks about climate changes. Everybody talks about water. But nobody thought in the beginning of 2020, when this slide was published, about infectious diseases. If you go to detail, they talk about infectious diseases. It might change society. And you see it is an increasing theme, and they pronounced this in the beginning of 2020 already, but not in this depth. Now it's appeared. Economic, environmental, geopolitical, and technological changes were more in the focus of this insurance group. This will be extremely changed over this year and for the next 2 years, in my view. What is it about this SARS-CoV-2? SARS-CoV-2, SARS is a member of a family that is since hundreds of millions of years existing on Earth and beating the animals and the human beings after that in evolution, because they have the ability to reach surfaces by these corona spikes. Corona means crown in Latin, and from this crown in the surface of the virus, you will see in a picture on the right side and an electronic microscope depiction on the left side, they attach to the surfaces of the animals they attach. They are originated in bats and have intermediate hosts, but for SARS-CoV-2, we don't really know this intermediate host. For others of the family, we know some hosts, but for this family member, CoV-2, we don't know. To see from this virus, there is a specific disease named by the World Health Organization. WHO named it COVID-19 because of the year in December, and the last day of December it appeared. And so this disease is named after this year. On the left side, you see again the structure with the surface and the spikes. The virus is able to attack the surfaces, and in the middle you see the information of the RNA, which is produced by the host and then produced with the surface proteins together to the family members and people, and infect the next ones. Here you see the family of the coronaviruses. You see the natural hosts, normally the bats. For SARS-CoV-2, we think it's horseshoe bat, but we don't really know. And a second one was found as a possible intermediate host on the animal markets for animals eaten by the Chinese people in Wuhan. You all know that might be the pangolin. So we have two candidates for hosting as intermediate host. But what about the bats? This is really interesting, because you could ask me, why do they survive, or why are they transmitted by bats? Why do they survive normally in bats or in mice? And the answer is really simple. They have an intermediate action with a virus, because they have an interferon, an immune modulator in their body, which accepts the virus and does not fight as much as it should be to eradicate the virus. So it might be as a parasite and still surviving. And the second thing you can see here, if it's not only natural hosted in bats, but also natural hosted in mice, it is possible perhaps to generate them in laboratories, and that's perhaps the reason for the SARS-CoV-2 virus might be generated in one of the labs in some countries in the world. I don't know where, and nobody knows really, but if you know in laboratory the surroundings, it is possible that one of these animals, as animals in research, might escape from these laboratories. And it is, of course, mice are so quick that it's not impossible, that it is not an criminal act or war act, but just an accident. What is about evolution? How are they connected? What is about the family link? The family link between these viruses, called petacoronaviruses, is the ACE, the angiotensin II receptor. Okay, some of you might be now awake and say, okay, ACE, that is one of the target receptors for antihypertension medication, perhaps for yourself or your family members. And this is very common antihypertension and heart insufficiency medication. And you may ask me, oh, if the virus is possible to go by this receptor, what about the people who are drug treated by this receptor? But up to now, there is not an increased risk for these people, not as we know. But these receptor differences make the differences in the family. And this receptor is the target for possible drug development you see later. Here you see the life cycle of such a coronavirus. It might enter by a receptor on the surface of a cell and come by processing to the nucleus, and it is reprocessed and rebuilt, reconstructed, and then again in the surface excreted to the people around and can infect the next. So the cycle is entry, and excretion to the surroundings. And the machine is in the cell. It's the nucleus of the cell. So without any nucleus of the host cell, the virus is not able to replicate, not able to rebuild itself. So it's not a self-living cell. It's dependent on the living cells of the hosts. What about symptoms? You all know, of course, about coughing, fever, and shortness of breath. But I'll show you later the data. Many of the people do not have these symptoms. They are asymptomatically infected. Perhaps it's not an infection. It's just a carrier status. And the other thing is, not these three symptoms are the main things you have to look for. You have to look for asymptomatic and symptoms of other kinds. For example, headache. For example, vomiting. For example, diarrhea. And 40% in the middle, some say even 80%, have a loss or change of smelling and tasting. So it's very typical for SARS-CoV-2 that it starts with a change or loss of smelling and tasting. The Latin words translated in English are anosmia or cacosmia and dysgeusia for the taste disorder. It may be transient, but it is often seen, and it might be very, very specific for these virus strain. The first thing I told you are the symptoms, and the second thing is most of the people are asymptomatic or mild symptomatic. Most means normally 95% of the people do not have a severe course. A severe course is normally lasting some days, so it's not from the grill party or the dancing party or the sport party and it's done in some hours. Normally it's done in some days that you come to pneumonia, the infection of the lung, and even some days more you get to the ARDS. Yeah, that means acute respiratory distress syndrome. I remember acute respiratory distress syndrome. I'll show you some slides later how it looks like, but it's important to know the severe course is seldom and it lasts approximately some days, 1 week. And the ventilator therapy is very, 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 very seldom needed. Outside of China, the data is around 2%, so 98% do not need a ventilator. And all the discussion now in the health systems around the world, especially in Europe, is how many ventilators does a society have and can prepare for the waves of the corona infections. And if you see here the numbers, it's normally a very small number who does really need it. And what is this artificial lung? Yeah, you can support the people who are really severe ill and normally so near to death that the lung might be substituted. And this is called artificial lung, ECMO. I show you later this system. What's important about corona? Corona, it's not only the fight of the body of the human being against the virus, so the viral response. That's as in every viral response in the human body. It lasts some days with coughing, fever, and the symptoms I taught you. Normally dry coughing and some seldom symptoms I told you again. Diarrhea, headache, don't forget, might be asymptomatic or seldom symptomatic. And after this viral response phase of some days a week, there might be a second stage where the lung reacts. So it goes from the nose, goes from coughing to the third symptom I told you, shortness of breath. So there is a lack of oxygen in the body. We call it hypoxia. And in this phase, it's normally that oxygen is substituted by nose or later on by ventilator therapy. And in this situation, there is the decision what will happen. Will the people recover or will they really critically ill and die? And this phase, from the viral response phase, changes to the host inflammatory response phase. So it's not the viral response that's the main problem. The main problem is the host reacts not alone against the viral, it reacts inflammatory. It makes an inflammatory reaction as a co-reaction, not as the main intent. The main intent is to act and fight against the body, but it reacts inflammatory as a second reaction in the so-called hyperinflammation phase. And that's the main problem. You find inflammatory markers, for example, CRP, lactate dehydrogenase, interleukin 6, and so on. And you see here, you find D-dimers found in hypercoagulation. And many of these people have thrombosis, lung embolia, and arterial embolia, even stroke. So if a patient comes with a myocardial infarction or stroke, you have to ask nowadays, is this a patient suffering from corona? So the hypercoagulation status might be a host inflammatory response phase in corona. We find elevation in heart insufficiency markers as NT-proBNP and troponin as muscle lesion markers, and ferritin as acute inflammation markers. So you have a broad spectrum of laboratory data that there's an inflammatory response phase. And this phase is the phase in the second medical drug we have to look for, because the viral response phase, if you come late in this phase, it's too late to react because the host inflammatory response phase has already started. And if you stop just the virus replication, it does not help really the body, because the inflammatory response of the body is always on the street and you can't stop it without stopping this. So you have two phases to look for treatment if you need treatment: antiviral and anti-inflammatory drug reactions. What is the hope for the virus infection? The hope is that it is relatively genetically stable. If you look to the data we mainly have nowadays from China, and it's beginning all over the world as well, the virus is relatively genetically stable. So if you remember other virus infections as HCV, human immunodeficiency virus by AIDS, or HCV and hepatitis C, these viruses are really genetically unstable, and you don't really have the hope to get a vaccine against these strains ever, because it changes so quickly that you won't have the hope to get a vaccine. But corona, SARS-CoV-2, is really genetically stable, and so there is hope for vaccine. But look a little bit back. What about the SARS-MERS infections 7 years ago? Up to now, we don't have any vaccine against these coronavirus. So it's a question, is it not interesting for the pharmaceutical companies? It's really more complicated, as I think and explained here. But if you go to the genetics, there is hope. So the second thing is develop vaccines to prevent the people, and don't need medication, drugs of the phases I showed you in ventilator therapy. And there are questions. What about the virus with infections? If it's done, if there's antibody producing, are the people safe? Are they protected? Some data from South Korea are really surprising because we found reinfection or against positive people with a PCR reaction. You can do PCR reaction. I show you the method just by taking props from the throat or from the nose, but you have to do it deep. If you just go to the front hole of the nose, you don't get the virus. You really have to go really back to the throat. Or if you just go to the lips or to the entrance of your mouth, you don't get the virus. So you have to do it by a doctor or patient itself, better the patient, because the pharmacy and the nurses and the doctors are not in risk of infection. But the patient often does not do it properly because they don't go really deep in the throat. And the virus changes from the nose and throat, as I told you, after some days to the lung. And after some days, really normally a week, I told you, it's not anymore seen in smears or swabs from nose and throat because it's in the lung. And then you can only find it by flushing water or something as saline in the bronchics. And we call it bronchoalveolar lavage or from blood. To protect, now you have different models. The safest is a model here called the FFP3 mask with a really good model time in Asian countries called N95. But this mask is really expensive. And sometimes in internet you may find even prices up to 99 euro. And the normal nose protector taken by patients or even you in the university later on is very cheap. But the difference between this and this is so protecting the people that is not going the virus through because it is not going in the mask. You can give it from outside the mouth through the mask to the surroundings, but in the mouth-nose protector, the virus can come through in both directions. So the difference is who likes to be protected. Is it medical stuff? You need really safe masks, FFP3, or the a little bit cheaper FFP2 type, and this is done by children here in Hubei. That is not normally possible because it's not in properly official times can be used. What is about the polymerase chain reaction? We have an RNA virus, not a DNA is shown here, but if you put some parts of the genetic information to the strain you look for, then it might fit and grow, and you can detect it with a very, very low sensitivity. So you might make some smears in a patient and it is positive, and the other day it might be negative. So it's 30 to 60%. It might be 50 in the middle. And every two people, one is just recognized. This is not good sensitivity, but it is probably done by this method failures I showed you. And the specificity, that means that if the virus is really found, that it is this virus is really high because it does match to the RNA strain or it does not match. So the polymerase chain reaction is the standard to detect, but you have to be in mind that the sensitivity is very slow, 50%. So we find patients who are coughing, we find patients, you have breathlessness of shortness of breath, you remember the symptoms, and you don't find any PCR in the nose or in the throat. Might be by the sensitivity because of the techniques I told you, or it's gone to the lung. So normally you have to look then to the radiation diagnostics department and do a CAT scan, a computer tomography scan, and this is fortunately with a high sensitivity. So if the CAT scan is normal, you don't have normally corona or any other infection. But if you have these infiltrates, it might not be corona. It might be a bacterial infection. It might be another viral infection. It might be fungi infection. So the specificity is low. So you have another method with high sensitivity, but low specificity. So sometimes you have to compare it. Sometimes you have to combine it. And some large university departments, for example, Munich, you know, in the southern part of Germany, do it routinely with patients who are coughing or symptomatic to see if these infiltrates are there, especially the infiltrates on both sides and near the pleura. That's a sign with consolidation. These two marks are the way to diagnose the COVID-19 disease. I promise you an RRDS, so an acute respiratory distress syndrome, and you see a white lung, really white lung. So if you look on the X-ray of a lung of a patient, you just see a white picture because it is really infiltrated and it is inflammatory reaction always on the run. What can you do? You can substitute the oxygenation progress with an artificial lung. I told you the ECMO, the extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, but I showed you it's just for a group of 30%, 50% in some institutions, but in large university hospitals, it's available, not in every hospital in Germany as well. You see the numbers of ventilators and you see the number of intensive care beds are very high in Europe and the developed world, but you see in the undeveloped or developing world, in India, intensive care beds are not so large. So it depends on the health system if it's a good reaction to deal with the infection or not. And that might be one of the explanations why Italy and France and Spain have so much deaths with an infection rate similar to the whole Europe, but higher death rates. It might be depending on intensive care beds, depending on ventilators. For example, Germany has 28,000 and increased it by a number in the crisis and bought some 10,000 new. Bought does not mean it is done in 2 weeks, but perhaps in 6 to 12 months. So the ability to survive is depending on the health system, and if there's not much system power, you have to triage. You have to ask who has the possibility to survive. And that's not depending on age or on culture, on haut color or something like that. It's just depending on your ability as individual patients to survive. And that's the ethical dilemma you always have as physician every day in your dealing with patients. If you have 10 patients at the same time and just can help 2, you have to ask, what about the 8 others? Are they in the same situation or are they lost? Then you can deal with the 2 patients, and this triage is one of the greatest things we have to do in medicine. Again, what about RIDS, the worst cause of the lung disease? It's treated by a spectrum of ventilation, non-invasive, up to the artificial lung. Don't go in detail, but the increasing severity of injury makes it necessary. Mild, moderate, or severe. Remember, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Johnson, had a mild to moderate RDS. He had non-invasive ventilation, and after some days, he lost his need to stay on intensive care. He was expelled from the hospital even, and after some weeks, he restarted with working. So if you go from the mild, moderate RDS, you can survive. If you're in the severe RDS, there are numbers of 10 to 20% of survival. So the question is if these people are treated properly, if there are some medication assistance are in the near future to assist the ventilator therapy to improve the numbers here. What's for you important? Important is distancing. You all know social distancing, and it relies on the transmission route of the virus. This virus is transmitted by large drops of 120 to 160 nanometers. No, that's 1 of 1,000 of a hair of yourself. Think, 1 of 1,000 of a hair of yourself. And it may enter your eye, so don't touch your face. It may enter your mouth, so don't touch your mouth. And it may enter by the nose, especially the nose cells are the surface cells which is entered by the corona spikes. So you have to social distance more than 1.5 meters, better 2 meters. Yeah, in Europe, normally, continental Europe, it's 1.5 meters. In Great Britain, it's 2 meters. And don't stay longer than 15 minutes to get possibly infected by these details. And we do have droplet infection by coughing. You see here a stroboscopic picture. It may be in some other types of infection routes as well present. Think about the smear infection in stool. So if you go to the toilet outside your home and it is not clean, perhaps on the airport or something like that, it might be a risk. No cases up to now reported with stool infection, but the virus is in the stool found and in cloacs in the towns as well. So don't touch your face. Remember, it's possible to get it not only by coughing, it might be somewhere else. The contact to surfaces is in discussion. So environmental surface, in the beginning, everybody thought, okay, it's just some hours. But up to now, we think, especially in steel and plastics, it's up to 72 hours that a survival of the virus is possible in the environmental surface. So if you touch, please clean your hands with soap. This is destroying the virus, or disinfect it by alcoholics, or wear gloves. But it is possible if you go by bus or train or something like that it survives 72 hours, and we don't know if you then touch your face or your mouth, your nose, then you could be infected. What about the data? Are the data reliable? We don't really know, because the data of China are so perfect, so good, so it might be politically influenced. But what is true, that the incubation period is different to other viruses, especially to influenza. I told you need some days that it is getting worse, but you also need some days that you are infected. So you really need 2 weeks from the infection time to the pneumonia, or 2.5 weeks perhaps to the RIDS from the infection people. And we know it from studies from people who were in sports, as football in Bergamo or in Heinsberg in Carnival in Germany. And these people are infected 2 weeks and a little bit more before they start to be symptomatically ill. And they are in 80% really asymptomatically. So in this epidemiological study, very briefly reported here, 80% do not have any symptoms. And that's the really sign of COVID-19 disease, that most of the people are asymptomatic carriers, and that makes the risk of this disease. The infection is growing exponentially. So if it starts, it goes exponentially up, but it's possible that the infection then goes to symptomatic curves. Here's just the beginning, in the beginning of March, and China begins to stop the infection rate here. So this is possible that it will stopping all over the world, but we don't know if it comes back in other waves. again, asymptomatic transmission. The people visited Germany coming from China, were really attending business meetings asymptomatically, went back to China, and the people in Germany got ill. The PCR got positive. So this is the proof of the asymptomatic transmission that is so typical for corona. It is spread then from the Chinese region all over the world. You already know, and you see in the beginning here a picture from March. There were no infections in the Varna or Bulgaria area, of course, and it started here in Germany in the beginning with 500 cases. I showed you now 170,000 cases. So avoiding traveling is one of the measurements to stop the infections. And up to now, most of the countries have traveling restrictions ongoing. I talked to you that the countries Great Britain, Italy, and France are suffering very hardly from the disease. Talked about the health system and causes why this is so hard there. And the health system in Germany, especially the number of beds and ventilators, is higher, so that might be different. And especially in this picture, Bulgaria is starting with some small numbers as well. But I don't think it's the gray here. That's the gray from Italy, so don't worry. It's in the very, very small numbers. If you go to the detail of Bulgaria from 2 days ago, it's, as I told you, and this is important here to see what about the mortality rate. The mortality rate with 80 deaths is high. In Bulgaria, near 5%. This is as high as you don't evade this, because in Germany we have a mortality rate lower than 1% or near 1%, so it might be 5 times higher the risk to die with corona in Bulgaria. But this is not really because of the health system in Bulgaria. It might be, but it's not really true. But we think the number of tests is the main explanation, because the test we do now is up to 100,000 a week, starting with 20,000 a week and now doing 100,000 a week. So it's just a question of proportion you test. The second question is, what is about the risk to get the coronavirus infection? And you see here the reproduction number R. So it's a calculation number by attack rate multiplied with contacts. And if you see this for coronavirus, it's around normally up to 1.4 to 2.5. It's in the same range as influenza, a little bit less even than the earlier SARS-CoV infections, and really less than the polio infection we fight against as Rotarians all over the world, or the measles. Nobody takes the measles vaccination in Europe, but it's many times more infectious than corona. And this number is now asked for the control of disease of a number lower than 1. Lower than 1.4 to protect the health system for the compensation. And if you look here, we started with 1.3 or so on, and we are now in Germany today at 0.7. And if you stay without any increase of cases and deaths lower than 1, we have the chance to treat them, to care for them in hospitals, and the number of patients with not active cases are ongoing, and the active cases are decreasing. And this is now the number we are looking for, the R value without the very sharp restrictions. So relaxation is the word. What is with a long-term view? Harvard Medical School in Boston says, okay, forecasting worldwide in 2 to 3 years will be 2/3 of the people, up to 2/3 of the people will be infected. This is a picture of influenza. One of the truths is that the influenza infection is in regions as hotspots. That's one we learned, as I told you, from Italy and the sporting events and so on. And it is seasonal. So it might be after the summer a little bit better. But if you look to Africa or South America, it does not stop there in the warm weather. So we do not have really hope that the climate is the only improvement factor. So it might be one, but not the only one. And seasonality and immunity combined, there is a possibility to calculate. So if there's a very large proportion of seasonality that is stopping after summer, and if the people are very high infected with a rate of 1 or 3, then it is possible that the number of patients to be calculated is lesser than the number is higher, and seasonality is not so good, and the people are not immune. Up to now, we have perhaps 3%, not 30, 3% with immunity in the German society, as we know. And we don't know if this immunity is really protecting. And if you see here the antibodies, that's the reason everybody asks for. Am I protected? Do I have antibodies? There are different ones. I don't go in detail, but up to now, we don't know if these antibodies are protecting, and we don't know that we have some information that it might be protecting for some time, perhaps for months and years, but we don't know who is really protected after proof of the antibodies in such an antibody test now available for $10 in a normal lab in some days. I told you about the hope of China. The symptomatic causes stopped, and the curve got to still stand, and there was a just recovery of the people infected. So mainland China was the first country with hope, and in Germany the number of cases is decreasing. If you see the actual numbers to the high numbers in the end of March, so we have the hope that the infection comes to a stop. But it is the main point to ask again, what about is mortality? And 5%, as in Bulgaria now, is really high. If you look here to the spectrum in non-China, normally lower than 1%, up to 5% in China. So there's a high number in relative numbers. But if you look to the other infections, the infection mortality risk in the other infection, especially in influenza or in the worse Spanish influenza, was really higher, and especially the number of cases are really higher. We talked about 200 million in today's speaking to 3,000 deaths in the beginning. We have now up to 60,000 deaths in the world, perhaps. So it's not comparable, but we don't know where it will be in 2 years. And the problem is the iceberg phenomenon, because if you don't test much, you don't know the number of cases, and you don't know what is the really mortality rate. Is it 5, as now seen in Bulgaria, because you don't test enough, and so the number is high, or it's 0.3 if you test more. That might be the truth in other countries. The spectrum is high. I told you 1% lethality normally in Germany, and in Italy up to 11%. So it's 10-point difference, or 10 times difference. So the time of reaction, the late reaction to infections, and the healthcare quality, especially in the intensive care units, in ventilator therapy, perhaps might be the explanation base for these differences all over Europe. The regional is not all over Europe only, it's in the country. You know, I'm active teaching in Seville, in España, and Andalusia has a very, very high rate of confirmed cases, of proved cases, but very low numbers of deaths. So it's really a question of the system additionally to the reaction against the disease, not only the stage, but to the quality of the system again. And we are worrying about developing countries, you know, especially in the middle of the equatorial Africa. The quality of the health system is not as good as in South Africa or Morocco or Egypt. So there might be 180,000 deaths calculated nowadays in Africa for the next years. So that will be one of the next great problems for the world. Risk groups. I'm a physician over 50-year-old with male sex, and these are risk groups. Not only the heart diseases, the liver diseases, the diabetes, immunosuppression, the cancer diseases are in risk. Just normal heart patients and patients about 50 to 60 years. We do have patients in childhood, we do have patients in adolescence, but they are really rare. There are some explanations why the heart is included as a risk organ, especially the inflammation might be one of the explanations. Inflammation is a part of heart disease in plaque instability, but I don't go too much in detail now. And the children, very nice pictures here in quarantine here with children. Not mine, I have two boys and older ones with 23 and 25. But these young people playing here and coloring papers, they don't have hard courses, they have mild courses. And the contact is not the problem, but the intents of the contact might be the problem. So we isolate them from their grandchildren to not transmit the virus from the kindergarten to the grandchildren. Women have a little bit less risk than men here, 1.7% to 2.8%, but 2.8 is 3 and 1% is 7, so the difference is not so great. And don't forget, you see people in the age of 20, you normally are as a student in economics, or 30 as your teachers or professors are in the 40s. So normally this is a risk group, not of 0, but it is a less risk than the aged people in the nurseries or in the families. To protect them is important. Protection, you all know the best protection is distance. I told you, because of the coughing of the viruses, and you can clean your hands at least for 20 to 30 seconds. You may pray in this time or sing in this time, but if you do it just quick, as normally men do, it is not helpful. And you need soap, because soap, in addition with water, is helpful to destroy the virus surface proteins. You should do it. Coughing in your elbow, don't touch your eyes. I told you, avoid the close contact. Stay at home when you're ill. The quarantine is necessary, and clean with soap and disinfection surfaces is necessary. Wear masks. We have now masks in shops and buses and trains and medical practices and hospitals necessary, but outside, not in Germany. Don't forget your first fingers on both hands, on the side and the back side, because normally, look at yourself, you wash the inside of the hand, you don't wash the outside of the hand, and you forget the first finger. So these are very old data of hand washing techniques of the 70s, and use it with soap 20 to 30 seconds. I told you, because the coronavirus protein is destroyed by the soap. In the high times of corona pandemia, there was a lack of everything. And here are pictures from Italy. They did not have really rooms and ventilators. They put the people in sporting areas and halls and treated them. They had not properly masked for everybody. So many physicians and priests are infected and killed in this pandemia, especially in southern of Europe, Italy, Spain, some especially in southern parts of Germany as well. So lack of everything, and you have to protect the helpers as well. So you must have a buddy who looks for you, that you are probably safe with their measurements, have a mask with a ventile to let the air out, and you have a shield if you have available to do aerosol producing measurements. These two things, mask, shield, additionally to clothing and gloves is important, and the second one looks for you is important as well. Additionally, we stopped, as I told you, as in SARS 7 years ago, traveling, did quarantine for 14 days, tried not helping drugs as antivirals, disinfecting the towns, hoped for the summer to get rid of it. Some pictures of China you've all seen, to control with temperature measurements in airports and in the train with cameras, to inform the people, to disinfect by night, by bus systems, even by helicopters, or here by drones. Some days it is done twice a day. So perhaps it's helping. Nobody really has tried it in controlled time, but China reported good numbers. Not so good numbers we have in Europe and USA. So perhaps some of these things we did not do. We do not do disinfections in the night. We do not use drones. Normally we do not use temperature control in the airports. So perhaps there are some things this is different to China. I don't know. What we all discuss data safety in Europe. And if you look to South Korea, they have a close contact detector tracking app, and we just developed it in Europe. And nobody now can go arbitrarily or with force to such an app, because we do not have it. We waited for in 2 months, but we will see if everybody will use it in Germany to see who is in the near, who can be a danger for you, and you can avoid a festival or something like that if it is shown. Festivals are shortened, closed, proposed to next year, you all know, and lockdown is now the word of the year, and we have to see what this is meaning by. The flattening of the course by social distancing means that we can help the social system, especially the health system, by social distancing, that there is not an increase in number over the capacity of the health system. And now we are on the situation to ask, what can we allow? What can we open the gate, reopen the gate? Here's from the Washington Post, a very good picture. If you make this gate more open, more of the asymptomatically or of the mild sick patients may enter in the normal surroundings and infect the people. So you have to discuss if this allowance of an on-off strategy is possible. We can't stop all of living and detecting people and living with the people and dealing with the people for the rest of our lives. So we need an on-off strategy, but it's possible that we do after this off time in a second wave, and then we have to go to a restriction again. In Germany now there's a limit of 50 infections per week per 100,000 inhabitants calculated. Some areas in the east and western part of Germany are over that. So they try to reopen the shops and the kindergartens and the schools as well. But we will see if this on-off strategy will work. You see this picture again, and on the bottom, potential therapies are shortly reviewed. We have some hope to the Ebola develop enzyme blocker remdesivir. there's no good hope to the malaria medications, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, but there's good hope to the plasma antibodies transfused from patients who recovered from the infection. So we have hopes and disappointing drugs. And if you see the targets for drug development, if it sees here again the possibility with the virus getting by spikes to the cell of the human being, you can block this entry by entry in bodies. You can block the construction of the virus by fusions inhibitors. You can block the protease inhibitors or polymerase inhibitors in the replication of the RNA, and the release inhibitors by expelling the virus by exocytosis. You can block as well. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 targets, and you have the antibodies I told you transfused from recovered patients as well. I don't go in detail, but I tell you that the drugs might have interactions, and you have large tables. You can look it up in the internet databases, that normal drug medication as a PPI, esomeprazole, to block the acid of the stomach might be safe. But if you go to medication, for example, against diarrhea, loperamide, there might be interactions, or some others, antacids, there might be interactions. So you have to look up each medication if these drugs in development might be interacting. And you have clinical control trials. You see here the HIV drug combination for Kaletra negative trial in this year. So it will be disappointing if drugs are not effective. And the FDA approval just for some very small difference here shown for the Ebola medication with an improvement in mortality rate of 3%, and just the duration shortening of illness for 4 days against placebo. So remdesivir approved in the US for these very, very, very small databases is more politically based than scientifically based. A negative study by the same drug in the Lancet. So the FDA approval is in very, very small feats. Passive immunotherapy, I told you that the antibody by the covered patients might be helpful. Just 5K support, so people recover. It's another option against this disease. The vaccines is the hopefulest option, but I told you in the SARS infection 7 years ago, up to now we don't have vaccines, but now there are 8,000 vaccines in development in hundreds of trials, and this slide is every day ongoing to be actualized. And the best would be if the people got the infection asymptomatically and are safe by herd immunity. But if you see now the numbers of 3% in the whole society, it's very difficult. So we discuss if you can check the herd health workers to see that they have care ongoing by the proof of protecting antibodies, but this is not up to date available, so we have to see. The second part, and for you the more interesting, is that the interaction to the economic sector is really large. You know, China and the whole of Asia is the development market of the future. Europe and the United States of America and the other rest of the world is more declining, as we all hoped. And Africa is not improving all over the time, but Asia is improving. If you see the gross domestic product here, it's a bad parameter, but the only one we have to compare societies. The world economic crisis hits the whole world. That's the message. The whole world, and the whole world is now interacting, connected by the global world. And this global world exists by imports and exports. The export from Germany in March declined 8%, so it's a dramatically decrease of export. So the money the companies have is low. The state does not get taxes. the people don't have income if they lost their jobs. So there's an interaction of all these things, and if the people don't have, if the state doesn't have money, the companies don't have money, the financial sector is of course in a mess situation. Look to the history. What is about past crises? You see the Second Gulf War in the 90s. The stock market index DAX in Germany lost 20%. The volatility in these crises is high. In other crises, financial crisis, Euro crisis as well, Corona crisis, the volatility stocks is very high. But the good message is normally it will be improving quickly. So if you look here to the SARS 2003 epidemic, normally it goes after some months, 1 year, 2 years, and there's an improvement even over the level before starting. So crisis recovery really quickly. The forecast is very, very slow. They don't know where the economy will be shrink in the next months. They calculated all over the year at the beginning of the crisis less than 1% for the most of the countries. But now, with the ongoing time, it might be more than less than 1%. By all the forecasts by the International Monetary Fund, by the Oxford Economics, or the German banking group of the Volksbanks. So it is very difficult to forecast, but the people hope that the crisis goes over after the summer and the economy starts quickly again. For example, the flights might be starting in the autumn. Lufthansa has cancelled 7,000 of 8,000 flights a day. So it's a very, very typical example of reducing economy by envirally pandemia. The stock market, you all know, is going down in the pandemia. The gold market is going up, and the recovery of the stock market can be expected on even after the crisis. This might be higher than before. It might be overcome. For example, the DAX was calculated starting at 13,000 points. The German stock market is at the bottom of 8,000. It reached nearly 8,500 and is now back to nearly 11,000. So I don't know if it's the future, if the second wave brings it to the bottom again, but it's worth, really worth around 8,000 points. So that it goes less than the worst, it is not seen, even not in these worst pandemia. You know, all the panic buyings and closing shops since the beginning of April here in Italy. The people lost their work. Germany started with short-term working. The people don't have to work. They get money from an insurance fund from the state, especially in the system of traveling, of car developing, of the metal industry, and the hotels and restaurants are all closed. So these sectors needed, not in the state department, because in the health department normally they are working. You see 21 are not working. These are normally the dental care workers, dental physicians, because the people don't open their mouths. They're are anxious to be infected. So there are people in health system who have problems. And the number of short-time working is now up to 10 million in Germany, starting with a number of just 4 and 5 million before, and now it's 10 million, more than the double in this crisis. In the US, unemployment number of up to 20 million now shows that there is an actual problem, but the hope is that the recovery of the economic will come soon. And you see here now the financial aids in crises, in historical crises. It's the same view as the historical view of the recovery. What do the states do to help? It's from the very early time of the French Napoleonic wars to up to date, and you see it is possible to help with money after the Second World War, in the oil crisis, in the financial crisis that the people get. This money might be bilateral from one state to another. It might be from multilateral helps from more states. So perhaps we will give money to Africa. We will give money to some countries in the south of Europe, and we will see that this crisis will be overwhelmed soon. What did the US Federal Reserve do? It reduced the key rate to a very, very low span of minus 0.5, and the quantitative easing was more extensive, mandated. You can get money easy, and you don't need so deep securities and investment safeties to get money from the bank. So a key rate reduction here is depicted. These are bank and state measurements to help in financial crisis. In Germany, we did the same. We gave money to the companies, corporate liquidity, financial market liquidity, so that's more easy. And we reduced tax for companies, and I showed you the short-term working measurements. These were the measurements we did now, and we give concretely money to self-employed patients. So if you're self-employed and a solo self-employed, you got directly 9,000 euro on your hand. Yeah, if you have up to 50 employees, you got 25,000 euro relatively quickly in 1 week, really untypically for a bureaucratic system. But this was the acute help, and we now have to look for the chronic things I told you with the liquidity and the tax reductions and so on. Even the hospitals were shielded by a hospital safety shield. They get money if they increase the intensive care beds, and if they did it new, they get 50,000 euro and money for the personal safety measurements. So it was a quick help, because there was a lack of everything, even in the perfect German health system. So what is about COVID and the global economy? What could happen? Naja, the first scenario is the worst is over, I think so, or soon, in some weeks, perhaps in the beginning of July. In China, the transmissions are slowed down. The economy recovers, they produce again, they deliver again. So we think that they effectively globally get under control, especially in hotspots with chain disruptions. So the global economy may be back, not in the mid of 2020, but I think there will be a global recession, not at this forecast, but it might be a global recession just for some months or for 1 or 2 years, not for decades, in my view. The second one, this scenario, is the year of the virus. Just in this year, I don't believe in this, because the virus will not go over. It will be ongoing if you relax, and relaxation of restrictions is the second word of the year. So we will have on-off strategies, and there will be weaker and stronger companies, and the stronger companies will survive, and we will have new models. Perhaps the state will go in companies, as discussed nowadays in Lufthansa, for example, and the global growth might be down first and higher later, and perhaps the high unemployment rate got under control in the next 12 months. We will see. But we will see a global pandemic response in the next 12 to 24 months. First, that will be uncoordinated. Perhaps in the next time the countries are more coordinated. The European Union has started coordinated development of vaccines for $8 billion. So there's a first coordination in decisions seen nowadays, and tourism and tourists suffer heavily, but I think there will be a reopening in the end of this year, and the global recession will be, yes, but it will overcome in months or even 1 year, in my view. So the global recession might be, but the lack of trust in companies and banks with a global financial crisis will be for a time of months and 1 to 2 years, in my view, and we have the chance to get rid of it. And don't forget Joshua Lederberg, the Nobel laureate. He said it's our wits, our intelligence versus their genes. Theirs meant the virus. So the COVID-19 2019 epidemic introduces unprecedented threats to health and economies, as well to politics, to all people, all of you. But it might be long-lasting, but I think if you use, and we all use our wits, we have a chance to overcome it. Thank you. I think it's time for questions. And remember, if you don't have questions or the ability to ask it, now write me an email. You get a promised answer, drhrbruch@t-online.de. Best greetings from Bonn, the former capital of Germany, in the Middle Age, around 1400, 1500. The mayor of Bonn was in this nice house, depicted in pink. So you saw in the beginning perhaps my pink shirt, or can see me in the classroom now in the pink shirt. So remember, that was a very modern color, and perhaps this will be the color for the future. Be happy and ask questions as much as you like. Thank you very much.